Welcome to a new episode of Die KulturmittlerInnen, the IFA podcast on foreign cultural policy. My name is Amira El-Al and I'm very glad that you're joining us again. In September 2022, nationwide protests erupted in Iran after 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the country's morality police on allegations of violating the hijab law, which mandates women and girls to cover their hair and bodies. Under the slogan Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, Women, Life, Freedom, thousands of people protested daily on the streets against the regime in Tehran. From school children to students, workers, and pensioners, many age and social groups were represented at these protests. 2 years have passed since then. From the outside, it looks like the protests have died down. The then President Ibrahim Raisi died in a helicopter crash, and a new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was elected in July this year. In this episode, we take a look at the developments in Iran and in particular at the situation of women who played a major role in the protests 2 years ago. My guest today is Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, the British-Iranian author and founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network, ICAN, has nearly 3 decades of experience as a peace strategist working globally on conflicts, crisis, violent extremism, and peace building with civil society, governments, and the UN. Through ICAN, she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, comprising independent women-led organizations active in 40 countries globally, preventing violence and promoting peace, rights, and pluralism. Since the beginning of this year, she is a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. Sanam Naraghi Anderlini, such a great pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to Die KulturmittlerInnen.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And I'm very sad that my fellowship time in Berlin has ended. I loved being in Berlin. So thank you very much for hosting me now. Yes, I'll be back in October, but it's my living time in Berlin has sadly come to an end.
Okay, so where are we catching you in right now?
I'm in London, so not too far.
Not too far away, okay. Sanam, take us back to the days after Mahsa Amini's death on September 16th, 2022. How did the news of her death spread and what happened then? How did the protests start?
You know, it feels like a long time ago, but I think the reason why it feels so long is that it wasn't just the first time that we had women out on the streets protesting against the hijab. It really felt like it was the culmination of 30, 40 years of a policy that the regime enacted back in 1979, and a policy that each generation of young women has fought against to the extent that they could when they faced the onslaught of the security and the sort of, if you want, the violence of the state. So when we heard the news of Mahsa Amini being killed, it triggered something so deep for so many of us around the world. Right? We were looking at the young girls in Iran. I was in America at the time. And, I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, she's the same age as my children. But at the same time, it was triggering my memories of being 18 when I first went back to Iran after the revolution. I left when I was 11 and I went back for the first time when I was 18. And it triggered memories of arriving and being covered and being fearful in the streets. And of course, in those days, I mean, the covering that we had to put on was even more stringent than what you see now. But it really felt as if it was 30, 40 years of trauma coming out amongst Iranians all over the world.
And I mean, the protests continued for a long time, over several months, and then they took on different forms, I think. The demonstrations on the streets, they also included civil disobedience or forms of strike actions. And although there is less media attention now, the movement is not over, yeah? What forms of protests are you still seeing now in Iran?
So this is where it gets very interesting. So I think the first thing is that what those protests showed, and has been persistent, is that the regime has lost. The regime's attempts to Islamicize society according to their very if you want, strict and extreme sort of version of Islam has failed. And they've anchored it in this covering of women, right? From the beginning, they put the scarf on, they made it mandatory, they threatened women with violence. Back in 1979, my mother's generation, they were threatened. And every generation, as I said, in my generation, people were pushing the scarf back inch by inch, shortening it, tightening the pants, tightening the clothes that they wore and so forth, just as not even an organized kind of protest form. It just became the norm for young women to push back in that way. What we saw with the Women Life Freedom movement was the most profound shift, I think, which is that we saw men standing shoulder to shoulder with women. And I frame it like this, that if in 1979, my father's generation of men didn't really take seriously when the hijab was made mandatory for women, they just kind of either sort of perceived it as it's not a big deal, or many of them may have supported it, more conservative families may have supported it. By the time it was my generation, my father was afraid for me. So when we went into the street, it wasn't that he thought that I should be covered. Of course he didn't. But he was worried that if I'm walking in the bazaar or walking on the street, that I should, that someone's going to come and grab me, that someone's going to come and tell me off, right? And that happened a number of times. In 2021, what we saw was that the brothers, if you want, so it's, the younger generation now, the brothers and the fathers and everybody's standing with their daughters and their wives and their sisters. And the mentality of the men has changed. And I think that's really critical, because in any society, if you have women progressing in one way and men feeling that progression is against them, that progress is going to get thwarted. Right? This time, what we're seeing in Iran, and this is why I call it a genuinely feminist revolution, it's that it's women leading. The messaging of women life freedom is something that resonates across the board, life and freedom for everyone. And it's not just about women's rights, it's challenging the essence of the state. It's a political statement along with a socioeconomic and sociopolitical statement and sociocultural statement. So it's quite extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah, it is. So you would call it a feminist revolution, even though you say that men are standing shoulder to shoulder with the women and that their mentality has changed. So you still would call it a feminist revolution?
I call it a feminist revolution because I work with women around the world dealing with conflict and extremism and so forth. And many of us, or in many of the places I work with, where I have partners, they can't call themselves feminist because feminist is understood in so many strange ways, and it can become radioactive and it can be threatening, right? But if you take the label away and you look under it, and you say, what are feminist values? What are feminist practices? And what we see repeatedly is that nonviolence is at the core of feminist action. You don't get mass women's movements picking up violence. You might get women joining violent, liberation movements, but inevitably they are the minority. Inevitably they're very rarely the leaders, right? Whereas when you've had women leading, what happens is that they take on, it's almost like a different language. They're using nonviolence to push the boundaries. And in Iran in particular, it reminds me of a poem that we learned when I was 9 years old in school in Iran. It used to be a poem that was taught in our school books. And it's the story of a little mountain stream coming down at the beginning of spring, and it hits a big black rock. And it says to the rock, would you mind moving? And the rock says, don't be ridiculous. What are you? I'm not this is my spot, right? And the little spring just carries on. And of course, water erodes rock. And so it erodes it and it becomes a river. And this to me is the metaphor for what I see when I see the women of Iran. As I say, it's generational, but this younger generation, and it's feminist, as I say, because it's nonviolent, and the actions that they used were nonviolent. We were seeing images of young girls, young women, 18, 19, even younger in schools, right? But there were images of these girls sitting on the street without their scarves, but just sitting. And, and security forces surrounding them, not really knowing what to do. Now, of course, we've seen also many, many images and horrific cases of violence and girls being attacked and so forth. But this idea that I'm just sitting, what have I done, right? It challenges the mentality of the young man who's standing there with a baton and has been told that these are bad girls, or these are they're immoral girls and things like that. So it's almost like two different languages. It's like the river and the rock. And the river ultimately wins.
Yeah. You cannot really overestimate, I think, the act of defiance by women to take off the hijab. I mean, in a country where it is mandatory to wear the headscarf and where you can go to prison for not wearing it. And then, doing this, as you say, like this it's a very non-violent resistance, but still it's very dangerous for them.
Yes.
And still, I mean, if you see news of Iran today and you see women walking on the street without the hijab, I mean, it's so daring. And you still see a lot of women doing this, young, older, very young women. So their everyday protest is still very visible, even if maybe the protests have died down more. But how can men make their protest visible in everyday life? I mean, for women, easy is the wrong word, but, they can take off the veil.
Yeah, so I think it's two things. I think one, as you said, what we also see in Iran very often is that you get a generation that protests against the regime, and the regime comes and has a heavy crackdown. Right. So they cracked down on the students in the 1990s. They cracked down on people on the streets when they protested the 2009 revolution. And then they cracked down heavily on the women life freedom protesters. But the crackdown is often followed by a backdown. And so the images that you're seeing right now of girls in the streets with their hair showing. Recently, somebody sent me a photograph of the platform in one of the Tehran metro, subway stations. And there is a lady who's completely covered. There's a lady who's covered in red, but she's got a big braid showing. And then there's a young girl who's wearing jeans and cut off, her shoulders are showing and she's wearing her hair long, right? And you just see this variety. And I looked at that and I was like, this is when we say that women are leading and women are winning, because essentially women have always wanted to have the choice. To have the choice to cover, to have the choice not to cover, to have the choice to wear a mini skirt or a long skirt or jeans or whatever it may be, and to have a control over our own bodies externally and internally, right? So this in Iran they're fighting against the hijab, and in the United States, again, we have extremist evangelicals and others who are who want to make abortion, who have made abortion illegal in many states. So it's the question of having choice and autonomy for ourselves. And we keep pushing those boundaries and creating the spaces. Now, what does it mean in terms of men and what they can do? They can join in, right? Because if you have men, again, whether it's your relatives, whether it's the public that you come across, whether it's the authorities, they can be part of enabling and supporting that. And I'll give you an example for, in the conversations that I've had with people in Iran in the years that I've gone back and forth. So according to Sharia law, right, the law, which is now the constitution in Iran, girls could be married off at the age of adolescence, and that's kind of shifted from 9 to 13, let's say, right? So by law, a girl could be married off at the age of 13, but somehow the system in Iran has evolved so that you get your identity card, you get an official identity card at the age of 15. And if you don't have an ID card, you can't get married, right? So you have the constitution supposedly claiming you can get married at 13, but actually, the civic system, the administrative and bureaucratic system doesn't allow it until 15. And the average age of marriage is actually well into the late 20s. So society is way ahead of all the norms. Now, again, according to Sharia law, once you get married, you have a marriage contract, right? In the marriage contract, very often the husband, the boy promises, gold or whatever, some mehriye to the girl, and she can also make her claims. In my family, our tradition was to say, I want to have my right to initiate divorce in that marriage contract.
Oh, wow.
Alongside, as equal to the man's. Because in Sharia law, again, a man can divorce his wife supposedly by saying, I divorced thee 3 times, and she's divorced. Whereas a woman would have to prove he's either insane or he's impotent. And, these are the 2 elements that would allow her to divorce. And at the beginning of the revolution, when they first imposed these laws, a lot of women would go to court and they would have to make up all sorts of stories about the impotency or the craziness of the husband. And eventually they would get their divorce, but they would give up the mehriye, the exchange or whatever it was that he'd promised. what we see, what I say to the young men now is that instead of promising insane amounts of money, which they would never have, why not just give her the equal right to divorce in the same way that you have, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember having this conversation with a taxi driver in Tehran, and he was saying that his friend had promised his fiancée 1,000 gold coins. They'd gotten engaged. She'd asked for the 1,000 gold coins. He couldn't deliver. And so she had him arrested for breach of contract. Mm-hmm. And that was a way of extracting money and then getting a divorce and living her life. And I said, well, imagine if you just gave her the right to divorce and right at the beginning said, if this is about love, we can exchange flowers or something. The monetary value can be diminished, but that you can put equal rights into your contract. Some men do it, and many men refuse to do that because they want to have the control, right? So there are ways in which in personal lives people can enable that equality, even if the law in principle doesn't give that equality to women. Sorry, that was a long way of going around telling you a story, but I hope it was clear.
No. Yeah, it's clear and it's very interesting. But I would like to maybe come back to what you said earlier about the heavy crackdown. I mean, the protests, we've seen how women and how men are still protesting, but they have been heavily cracked down, and there was really a strong reaction from the regime. So even though the protests are continuing, we also see that the regime is intensifying the repression. Just a few days ago, the UN experts expressed alarm over a surge in executions during the month of August and urged the Islamic Republic of Iran to immediately stop the execution of people facing the death penalty. I think the reported number of executions this year alone has risen to more than 400, amongst them 15 women. At the same time, the situation in Iran is getting less and less media attention and coverage due to the war in the Ukraine, but also the war in the Middle East. What implications does this situation have for the opposition in Iran and the protests currently?
So I think, if we look at it from an international standpoint, right, one of the things that I get worried about is that, when you have the, protests abroad, right, we have Iranians in diaspora protesting, demanding that, say, we end diplomatic relations, kick out all the Iranian diplomats and so forth. What happens is that they reciprocate, right? And they kick out German or European diplomats, or they also cause limitations and put constraints, on the role of outsiders. Again, based on my observations and the work that I've done, I don't say this because I'm a fan of the regime in any way, but what I think is that it's really important to be present to shine a light, right? It's very important to be present and have the diplomatic presence and relations that are good in many ways. At least good as in what I mean is respectful, so that if and when you want to exercise your right as a diplomat to go into and observe what's happening in a court of law, you can do that. If and when you want to go and say, I want to, we have the right as diplomats to come and visit prisons and so forth, exercising the international rules and norms is part of the leverage that that our diplomatic systems and the international sort of body of law allows for. But if you're absent, you can't do that.
You can't.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if you're absent, it means there's even less attention to these issues. There's even less engagement to understand really what's going on and find nuances of how you might engage, what you might say, and so forth. So that's one thing that I really actually worry about, the kind of isolationism that we are enabling from the West towards Iran and other countries. And to be honest with you, the isolationism feeds and emboldens the extremes. And this is another thing that it's often not talked about in the media. But, if tomorrow economic sanctions were removed and we had some level of normalcy in terms of people-to-people exchanges, it would diminish the power of the hardliners in Iran. The isolationist forces in Iran don't want contact with the outside world.
Yeah.
So that this puts a question around what are the strategies and tactics that we are using from our side.
So, but how would you evaluate the international response to the protests? Especially if you look at the EU and Germany, I mean,
I don't think that they had much effect. I think there's a lot of virtue signaling right? But I don't think that bashing the regime and constantly sort of naming and shaming has had any effect in terms of their tactics at home, right? As you said, the executions are up. So, do we, what you could argue that either it's had no effect whatsoever because the executions are up, or you could say that it's doing more harm because the executions are up. But whatever it is, the executions have increased and abuses of human rights have increased on one level by the state. And on the other level, the public is doing the girls on the street are doing whatever they were going to do anyway, regardless of what we say in Germany I don't think that they're listening to the German foreign minister to get, instruction about, whether they should have their hair out or not. Do you see what I'm saying? So there is a question of the value. Now, one aspect of this, which I think is important, is that when you are isolated, and Iran is very much, or Iranian civil society and the public at large is increasingly isolated from the rest of the world because of sanctions, because of visa restrictions, all these things, to know that the world is paying attention to you and that you're not forgotten, I think is really important. So whether it's the music, whether it's in the public sphere and the cultural sphere, etc., I think that solidarity is extremely important. But from a governmental standpoint, if we're going to critique, and especially from the UN standpoint, if you're going to report, I actually would like to know what's the next, how do they strategize to be effective? That, I think, is the real crux of it, because we have we have mountains and mountains of reports about everywhere. But what difference does it make? So maybe it's time to think about new out-of-the-box strategies, different ways of thinking about it, and very much listening and heeding the advice and the counsel, if you want, and the recommendations of people who are on the ground and asking them, what do they want?
Yeah. So if you talk to people on the ground, which you, I assume, do very regularly, do you feel or hear that people feel let down and forgotten by the international community?
I think so. I think it varies enormously because, if you think about the effect that sanctions have had, okay, sanctions have affected the import of really critical medical supplies, medicines, things like, and again, if you take it, let's say we just think about it in terms of women, right? All sorts of things to do with women's health are missing. So it's one thing to say, oh, we're sanctioning because we don't like the regime. It's a whole other thing saying we want to take actions that can help the society thrive and people thrive, while also critiquing and diminishing the power of the regime. And frankly speaking, when you have authoritarian or dictatorial regimes these days, when you put sanctions, they benefit. They and their friends find ways around them, but ordinary people don't. And so in Iran, we've had an incredible diminishing of the independent economic sector and the middle class and so forth, who had normal businesses and were hiring, kids out of school and out of university since 1994, frankly. We've tracked it over the years. So if you squash all of that, business continues, but it's going to be in the hands of people who are close to the regime. So at the end of the day, you have to wonder, what is the end goal? Is it just to make ourselves feel good about, the fact that we're taking action, or is it actually to try and make a difference on the ground over there? And related to this is the other big challenge, which is that, we saw this with Iraq when Saddam Hussein was in power. The assumption that, if you squeeze people hard enough, they will rise up and try and overthrow their regime. That theory also doesn't work. It just has not worked. We can't assume that just because sanctions worked in South Africa back in the 1990s, that the same policy is going to work in 2024 or 2025 in other parts of the world. So we need a different playbook, and we need some bold thinking on the part of our foreign policy experts.
Yeah. And I guess it also gives the regime some sort of legitimization if you talk to them about their nuclear program and you keep on, and the sanction they get stronger inside, I guess, in a way.
Exactly. And just to add to that, I mean, the whole nuclear deal was meant to be an opening to be able to have some engagement, to reduce the sanctions, to sort of begin to foster some sort of relationship. The Trump administration threw it out. The Biden administration also didn't really do very much. And in fact, even Obama didn't reduce the sanctions. So people didn't really feel the difference on the ground. So that was one thing. The other thing right now is that when you look at how the West dealt with the Taliban, how we basically handed Afghanistan to the Taliban at the negotiation tables in Doha, and what's happening to Afghan women, at essentially
the cost of women,
sort of instigated by our policies, Iran looks, like a progressive place in comparison, right? So the Iranians are looking, it's now really easy to criticize the West and say, you guys are hypocritical. Look at what you did over there. Similarly with Gaza, the starvation that's happening in Gaza, the fact that medicine isn't getting in, the fact that, women are having cesareans without anesthetic. How can we possibly talk about women's rights and criticize Iran when our various governments are enabling that policy and the killing of children and so forth in Gaza? So, hypocrisy and inconsistency really undermines what we stand for, what we claim we stand for.
Yeah. So talking about hypocrisy brings me to a next point, which is the feminist foreign policy, which has been implemented in many countries around the world, amongst them Germany, France, Mexico, Chile. Has this had any implications on how these countries have dealt with Iran in the aftermath of the uprising? And how is this feminist foreign policy perceived by the civil society in Iran? Is it even, a topic, or is it even recognized?
I doubt that Iranian civil society is sitting there thinking, gosh, they have a feminist foreign policy. What does that mean? I certainly in other countries, we're not really seeing much of a discussion about it. And even where there is, amongst, those of us who are aware of this and are trying to sort of connect and bridge between the existing silos, it's really difficult because what do we mean by feminist foreign policy, right? As I said at the beginning, if I were to talk about my experience of feminist action and feminist priorities, nonviolence and a reduction of violence and militarism is it comes pretty high in our realm of thinking about issues, right? It's not to say that everybody is a pacifist, but it's saying that across the board and across time and geography, what we see is that when women engage and feminists engage, they are trying to reduce militarization as a solution. So you look at that, and then you look at where our budgets are going, and development budgets, budgeting for anything to do with peace and diplomacy has been radically cut down, including by the current German government. But it's across the board in Canada and elsewhere that claim feminist foreign policy. So, so from a budgetary standpoint, one has to question what the priorities are. From a practice standpoint, we have to question it. It's now 2024. From way back, we were advocating for the participation of Afghan women and other women in peace processes. Afghan women are still kept out of the negotiations with the Taliban. They're still kept in the dark. Vis-a-vis Sudan, we are, making it like sort of centimeter by centimeter progress to have some space for women in the dialogues. But it's been nearly 25 years of having policies and laws and so forth. So, if we're going to call it feminist foreign policy, it needs to be radically different across the board in all the different areas of the German sort of engagement with the world. And sadly, I fear that right now we are in the realm of old wine in pink bottles, basically. And it's actually going to do harm to any of some of the progress that we've made, like as we've seen in Sweden. In Sweden, the new government just got rid of feminist foreign policy. But ironically, when you look below the surface of what they're actually doing, they haven't necessarily changed a lot of the way that they understand the importance of women's organizations and so forth. But they've kind of taken a political action against it. So in the context of Germany, if I were in charge, I would be saying, please, let's look at the coherence, let's look at the vision, let's look at the values, and let's make sure that we're not instrumentalizing women. And as I say, kind of just putting, pinkwashing what we're doing, because that's detrimental to us, to Germany and its own values and context, and it's detrimental to women around the world.
So let's go back to 2022. the uprising morphed into the most serious challenge to the legitimacy of Iran's ruling clerics since they took power in 1979. Still, the regime prevailed until now. In an interview with CNN shortly after the protests began in 2022, you said that these types of protests ebb and flow a great deal, and that women were on the forefront of many protests, be it in Sudan, Myanmar, Egypt, Yemen. And you kind of warned back then because there was so much enthusiasm, especially in the West. And you said that one should not underestimate the responses and the systemic and structural forces that exist in such regimes, and that there will be a backlash. You said, looking at other countries, this is worth bearing in mind. I guess you were right to be cautious looking at the current situation. Can you explain how the regime survived the protests, the serious challenge to their legitimacy, and what was missing to overthrow the regime back then?
Thank you. I think I gave those comments before the outbreak of the Sudan war, but sadly it was prescient because now we're dealing with a horrific situation in Sudan as well. How does the regime survive? The regime survives for multiple reasons. Number one, when you've had, going back to the sanctions, when you've had years and years of sanctions and the regime and its kind of ecosystem gobbling up the economic space and becoming de facto the main employer of many, many young people, family, being the feeder of families, right? You have to bear in mind that there are millions of people whose bread on the table is tied to the stick in the hand of the father or the husband or the brother or whoever it may be, right? So the question of how many people are beholden to the regime for their daily bread is an important question. And you can't just say, the former Shah's son, one of the things he was saying to the Revolutionary Guard was, if you leave the Revolutionary Guard now, we won't prosecute you when we come to power. And it was so absurd because he was sitting in Potomac in Maryland saying to, a bunch of people in Iran, risk your lives now so that later on we don't prosecute you, assassinate you. I don't know what he was promising not to do if they didn't, give up their support for the regime. But, people are pragmatic. They will look and see which way they should lean. And I think that you can't underestimate the number of people that are beholden to the state for their livelihoods. As I say, it has to do with the fact that other employment opportunities aren't there. So that's one thing. The other thing which got missed in all the news and everything was that, Iran is surrounded. There are lots of American bases. There were in Afghanistan, there is in Iraq. And then, of course, you've got Saudi Arabia and the region also at play. And one of the things that, if we look at the long term, at the sort of, what happened with Iraq in the last 20 years and so forth, is that every time one of these authoritarian regimes fell, there was an opportunity where the locals had risen up and there was a sense that, wow, there's a possibility of a democracy emerging from this. And, whether it's Iraq, whether it was Libya, they had wealth. So there was wealth, there was education, there was the public. And if Iraq or Libya had become a stalwart of democracy or a bastion of democracy in the Middle East, they would have threatened Saudi Arabia and its Wahhabi, very extremist versions of Islam. And they would have probably challenged Israel more effectively in terms of its treatment of Palestine and become they would have contained the power of the UAE, which is now becoming a military force and then projecting its own influence around the region. But none of those countries ever made it, right? Mm-hmm. And in the case of Iran, when we were watching this, the Saudis, just as the regime was getting kind of weak, as you said, it was really feeling the threat and the heat from the protests, the Saudis come in and make a deal with the regime. And to me, what that signaled was that the Saudis, the US, etc., didn't want the regime to collapse and create a vacuum. They didn't want chaos in a major country in that region, because out of chaos comes all sorts of things that you don't know. So they didn't want the chaos and the uncertainty. They didn't necessarily want a democracy, because a democracy would have threatened and challenged them in terms of the status quo that's there. They didn't want a strong Iranian regime either, because that challenges them from another standpoint. They wanted a weak regime with which they could get along. And that's what they got. They made the deal. It stabilized things for Iran. It stabilized things for the region. And, life goes on. It has enabled the state to sustain itself. And then the third part of all this is that the regime in Iran is very astute to what it needs to do to survive for itself. And this is what I mentioned earlier when I said, there are crackdowns, there are backdowns. When we see women walking in the streets, wearing a variety of different types of clothing or uncovered and so forth, these are ways in which the regime is letting steam out and letting some pressure off, right? It's it maintains control, but it just occasionally kind of turns the dial down and allows people to carry on their lives. And things evolve in this way. And that again is one of those kind of tactics that the public understands. It pushes, the regime pushes back, then the regime inches forward a little bit. And the fact that we have Pezeshkian, being allowed to run for elections and being purported as a more reformist guy is part of that solution. The public vote for him because they have a choice between bad and worse, and the regime puts him there because he's okay for them but more palatable to the public than the hardliners. These are the ways that they continue to survive, I think.
Yeah. So what would you say would this new president and the new parliament mean for the movement? I mean, could this bring about any change for the situation of women in the opposition in Iran? I mean, you just said he is labeled a reformist. He kind of said, something, and his views on the hijab. He apparently said that the hijab crackdown jeopardized human dignity. I mean, is this just a sham? Is this just tactics?
I don't think it's a sham, but I think that it's less sort of powerful than it sounds, in words, right? The rhetoric does represent something, but it's not entirely false, and it's not entirely kind of, that progressiveness that we would want. But again, the proof, if you want, is when you take a snapshot of the streets of Tehran or any of the provinces, let's say Tehran is the big urban hub, but if you go around the provinces and you look at the way women are dressed and how society is managing itself, if the more we see women in the variety of clothes, getting on with their lives, in public spaces, doing what they need to do. These are all ways in which they are dialing down and trying to navigate and evolve the system. One of the things that we have to remember is that this regime's identity is, there are sort of few pillars that define the Iranian regime as an Islamic republic. What is it that makes it Islamic, right? And essentially, they've put their Islamicness or Islamist, I wouldn't even call it Islamic, is Islamistness in terms of their social control. And their social control is basically related to how women are treated and how women look. So in a way, if they suddenly said, oh, yes, women can wear whatever they want, they would be a kind of different regime, right? It would be a transformation. So they struggle with that. And of course, they have their own hard line flank behind them that kind of pushes also. So it's kind of the direction of travel. It goes back to what I was saying about the trickle, the mountain stream and the river. The river is coming and the river is flowing. It's just that maybe the rocks aren't willing to admit it and are trying to sort of navigating it so that it doesn't implode and become chaotic. And I think this is one of the things that is also worth remembering, that we, my generation, I was 11 when the revolution happened, but we saw the revolution. Then my generation experienced the Iran-Iraq war. People in Iran are wary of just being against something. They may not like the regime. They may despise the regime, and most do. But they have had the experience or the historic memory of being out against something without being clear about what would come next, what comes the day after, what are we for? And this is where, again, the opposition movements and others have consistently failed. They have not been able to articulate a clear vision of what does our future look like? How do we deal with those that are, the 20% that may align with the regime or the conservative values and so forth? So long as you don't have a clear vision of what you are for, the incumbent regime will stay in power because a lot of people are going to be afraid of the uncertainty and the chaos that could ensue, and the worst elements that could arise if you have a toppling of a regime, and then something the something new could be worse than what we already have. These are things that as Iranians we've kind of lived with and have experienced at a high price.
Yeah, and if you look at countries that you just mentioned, also Libya, for example, then you see that where it can lead, and it's not really something to aspire to. But as you said, to articulate a vision and to what will the future look like, do you have the feeling that the youth have lost faith in change? I mean, if you look at the turnout of this year's parliamentary elections, it was only around 40%, and especially the young people boycotted the election. Do you feel that there's no more faith that things will change?
I think that there is deep skepticism and, loss of legitimacy of the existing state, right? Of the way things are. Back in 2009, people were saying, okay, let's use the same structure and bring in new people, and they can rearrange and evolve from within. That was the promise of the reform movement, if you want, that, we will reform. But even they never really articulated what it would look like ultimately. Right? It was like, we're going to change. But if you said to them, what are you going to change? What's it going to look like? They didn't really have a clear answer. But what I see now is that while the legitimacy of the state and the state system has diminished significantly, I think people in their own minds and in the sort of the younger generation are actually better placed in terms of articulating what they do want. And this is, again, where Women Life Freedom comes in, and it's so powerful. The song Baraye, the one that the young man who was arrested and has been banned. But this was a young chap. He asked people through social media, what are you protesting for? Baraye means for, right? And he made a song taking the messages that he received from people. And if you look at the lyrics of that song and you say, put that and say, this is the vision. This is what we want for our society. The bad things we want to get rid of and the good things that he talks about. That's a pretty compelling vision of the kind of society that people want. And again, as far as I'm concerned, like, the labels are irrelevant. What do we call it is not the issue. It's the substance that should be looked at. And I think the public and the younger generation are really there. But yes, they have no faith in the existing system and structure that around which their political activity, around which they're allowed to vote. You get to go vote, but so what? The candidates and how much power each of those candidates has remains limited. And so those are the tensions that how can the system evolve itself to be more inclusive, to evolve towards a democracy and diminish the power of the unelected elements and the sort of theocratic elements and the military, frankly, the Revolutionary Guard. These are all big questions that are out there. But, sometimes it's important to understand the cultural DNA of a country. And Iranians it's an aspirational society. So even people who come in and gain power or have benefited from the revolution in one generation, by the second generation, their kids are against all the limitations that the regime puts on them. So I think that's also part of the sort of dynamism and the flux that I think gives me some hope around how things can evolve and change without having absolute chaos again.
Yeah, that sounds good. But we've been talking a lot about Iranians in Iran. I would like to shed light on the many Iranians in exile. Iran is a country where not only you can be punished severely for your actions, but also your family can be severely punished for your actions. So many Iranians have fled the country also after the protests and still want to be active in exile. How difficult is this, knowing that you possibly put your family in danger? And how can you exert influence from abroad?
I think this is one of the hardest challenges that we all face. My father was alive until 2015, and it was always a concern that, what am I saying? What am I doing? And even now, I have other relatives that are there. My work overall has not been focused on Iran, primarily because I didn't want people with whom I associated with to be affected, like even colleagues in Iran, right? So I've done research there. I never did anything in any sort of clandestine way. When I was allowed to go and do workshops during the Khatami year and stuff, we were talking to people who were working with children and in rural areas and so forth. But the minute you get targeted, anybody that has any association with you gets targeted, and they are vulnerable because of their affiliation with you. And so I think that this is one of the most heart-wrenching aspects of the division between being a diaspora or being inside the country. So definitely I feel for those who have come more recently who feel that they still want to connect and still be active, but worry about the effects on people they care about and their families back home. It's a very, very real concern.
Yeah. I mean, you've already given a statement of hope, but maybe like as a last question, and maybe like in a, I don't know, short one sentence, because we're running out of time, but is there something that makes you hopeful that change will come for the people in Iran sooner rather than later?
Oh, yes, the girls. The girls and the boys, I should say. I mean, you can't stop the power of the future. And they are the engine of that country. And I think that, again, if I were in charge, I would try to open up every opportunity to them, engage them in the world, let them thrive, let them thrive and benefit from what the world offers, but also acknowledge what Iran brings as a country, our history, our culture, the arts, and all the sort of incredible education, frankly, that's there. But I think that this is, right at the beginning, I said this, I wish that there was a different way of looking at and engaging and, putting all the tools back on the table and thinking what could enable and support this younger generation, which has already put its life at risk and put its life online for women, life and freedom. How can we help them? Because they are the hope, and I have immense respect for them. They give us so much joy and inspiration every time we see what they're doing.
Thank you, Sanam Naraghi Anderlini. Thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please feel free to recommend this episode to others. Also, you can find over 60 episodes on our website, ifa.de, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also subscribe to Die KulturmittlerInnen so you don't miss any of the upcoming episodes. You can find out even more about IFA and our projects on our website and our social media channels. You can find our profile on Instagram with the handle @ifa.de and on LinkedIn as IFA Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen. If you have any questions or comments about the KulturmittlerInnen, please send us an email to podcast@ifa.de. My name is Amira El Al. Thank you so much for listening and see you next time.